Hello, cruel, cruel world. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm an NHS doctor and a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. You can call me the ominous Shamanus. So I'm sure that you've all heard about the comments made by Lady Susan Hussey, which were racist. But were they? I mean, obviously they were, but were they actually? We'll explore that in this episode. Also, we'll ask the questions, what is racism? How important is context to racism? Can racism ever just be banter? What is institutionalized racism? How does institutionalized racism present itself in my area of expertise, my work, which is mental health care? What are the psychiatric and psychological consequences of suffering racism? And then we're going to end with my in-depth analysis of the comments by Lady Hussey. I should say that everything in this video is just purely my opinion. I am, of course, not representative of all brown people, only the good ones. Okay, so let's get started. First, what is racism? First of all, I'll tell you the basic meaning, and then we'll do a deep dive about the context. So racism means using the concept of race to judge or treat some people worse than others. It can exist in many forms and in many different kind of levels in society, including mental health care, which we'll come on to. It can include acts of discrimination and prejudice towards individuals and groups, and it can also describe a wider system of oppression. So far, so good. I mean, that's a bit of a simple definition, but like your grandpa used to say, the complicated things in life are very rarely simple. Let's not talk about the other thing that your grandpa used to say, because that is terribly offensive. So the definition's all well and good, but I think that context is always important in racism. So it's not just what is said by Lady Hussey or other people, it's the intention behind the statement and also the backdrop and the kind of setting. So for example, the question, where are you from, is obviously absolutely innocent in, say, like a backpacking hostel in Amsterdam, but the question, where are you from, cuz, can be extremely dangerous and potentially even life-threatening in a hood in Compton or in South London. So it's what is actually meant behind the question rather than the words. And also, in terms of context, it's also about the target's lived experience. For example, me, I grew up in a relatively middle-class area. I did experience some racism. It was always verbal, it was nothing physical, and it was unpleasant. And I might have found it unpleasant, but my reaction would be very different, both my reaction and the connotations to, for example, a teenager growing up in Eltham in southeast London, where Stephen Lawrence in April 1993 was murdered. So he's a black British teenager who was murdered by complete strangers in a racially motivated attack whilst waiting for a bus, completely unprovoked. So my point is this, is that you will feel, if you grew up in that area, if you knew Stephen Lawrence, if it happened to your friends, if you grew up in an environment where you lived in fear of being, physically abused or even killed, then that is going to change the way that you perceive racism compared to somebody else. And again, still sticking with the theme of context, I think it also depends on the actual relationship and the dynamic between the perpetrator and the target. So Lady Susan Hussey, which we will come onto at the end, she said her comments at a reception to Ngozi Fulani, who's a black woman. So Lady Hussey was supposed to be welcoming her. She was a representative of Buckingham Palace. So that is also important in the context, given the kind of colonial history. All of which leads to quite an uncomfortable question, I think, which is, can racism ever just be banter? So lots of different people tease each other for their differences and for their imperfections. And I think this is often meant to be like terms of endearment. And for me, if I had to sort of psychoanalyze it or boil it down, I think it's about the status that the victim has within the group. So if you feel that you're sort of welcome or you're equal as part of the group, then it's possible, I think, for it to be banter, for it not to be offensive. But if you feel lesser for whatever reason, again, maybe because of your shared experience or because of the dynamic of the person saying it, who's supposed to be like a representative of something formal like Buckingham Palace versus what you are as a guest, then that affects how racism can be perceived, I think. Having said all that, I think that banter can be racist. I think if it's not meant to be hurtful, then it's not racist. But here's the kicker. It's not just the intention of the perpetrator that is important, but even more so, arguably, it's the feelings of the receiver. And the irony is the kind of group that would have this kind of racist banter is likely to also be hyper-masculine. So basically what I'm saying is it's quite hard to stand up and say if you feel offended. If your boys are making fun of you for whatever reason, your skin colour, your being overweight, having webbed feet, you don't want to appear hurt, because even if it does hurt, it's not cool to like be offended. It's kind of easier to laugh along with it. Dear viewers, am I being unrealistic? Is it possible? Do you agree that it's possible for racism to be banter or vice versa? Let me know in the Schmomich section below. The other thing I'd say about racism that we can't forget is hurtful stereotypes. So, for example, the Indian people are, good at maths, we're terrible swimmers, that we have small genitalia. It's completely incorrect and it's really hurtful. I mean, happens to be correct in my particular case, but you know what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say is that stereotypes in general are hurtful, they're ignorant, they're lazy, and I must insist that you stop using them, otherwise I'll get my Chinese cousin to come around and kung fu your ass. Okay, moving on. What is institutional racism? This is where an organisation treats others poorly or unfairly because of their race, and it can be unintentional as well as intentional. Sometimes organisations don't even realise how their policies and their practices might disadvantage a certain group of people. For example, sometimes in terms of schooling and education, some areas don't discuss diversity or Britain's colonial history in classrooms at all. There's no kind of contributions acknowledged from Black, Asian or other marginalised background. As an example, not many people know that 90,000 men from the Indian Army lost their lives on behalf of the UK during World War II. So they were the British Indian Army. It's a British force, British run, but literally tens of thousands of soldiers lost their lives, even more were injured. Very rarely mentioned in history books, let alone in the classroom. I personally don't think I learned anything about Britain's colonial history at all, not even one single thing in all of my history. It was all about Henry VIII and how many wives that she had. I'm not saying that English people or Britain in a whole needs to be like ashamed or embarrassed about it, because it was the actions of of forefathers, but at least acknowledge it, at least know your history, I think is very reasonable. Okay, moving on. I'm ashamed to say this, but another area of institutional racism absolutely exists in my field, in psychiatry, in mental health. So an independent review of the Mental Health Act in 2018 noted that a disproportionate number of people from Black and ethnic minorities were detained under the Mental Health Act. Not only that, but Black people are 40% more likely to access psychiatric treatment through police or the criminal justice system. So what I'm saying is they're much more likely to be arrested and then taken into like A&E because they're acting bizarrely, whatever it is, and then get sectioned into a psychiatric hospital, as opposed to, for example, going to the GP because family members are worried about somebody becoming psychotic. So it's almost like something has to go really badly wrong and they have to be arrested, perhaps in a kind of confrontational, even violent circumstances, before they're even offered the help that they should have got earlier down the line. On top of that, the review showed that Black people are much less likely to receive less restrictive practices. So they're less likely to receive like psychological therapy, talking therapy, versus being like forced medication. On top of all of that, they're more likely to be compulsorily admitted for treatment. So they're more likely to be sectioned than to be a voluntary patient, and they're much more likely to end up on a secure unit, like a medium or high secure unit, compared to white counterparts. I've got a lot more to say on this topic, but I've done it all already on a video about ROCKY Bennett, and I'll put the links in the description below. So basically, it's a horrific case. It's shameful in the world of forensic psychiatry. It's a case about a man called ROCKY Bennett who died on the 30th of October 1998 in a medium secure unit in Norwich because he was restrained by staff until he literally couldn't breathe. And institutional racism was found to be one of the factors in this case, which led to his death. So go check out that video, it's sober watching. Okay, moving on. What are the psychiatric and psychological consequences of suffering racism? Well, there's the obvious stuff, like all kinds of trauma can cause anxiety and depression. I'm not going to patronize you with that. I'm going to tell you about the more kind of intellectual areas, because my goal for making these videos is to educate you, get you thinking like a psychiatrist, also to take over the world, but that's not going so well. So what are the consequences? It can make you feel unwelcomed, lonely, isolated, especially if people or organisations have said things that imply that you don't belong, like Lady Hussey may or may not have done. We'll get to that. It can make you feel anxious, fearful, unsafe. Imagine growing up in an area where, you know, black teenagers are literally getting killed. You may worry about how people perceive you and treat you when you leave your house. You might feel visibly very different and vulnerable when you're around people of different races. Growing up as an only brown person in a completely white school, I can attest to that. You may spend a lot of time thinking about how you're going to protect yourself when you enter certain spaces. You may be angry or frustrated, particularly if you feel that you're being treated unfairly and if you feel powerless to control it. I think that's one of the major factors to why there's beef, let's say, between certain aspects, certain hoods in London or in any major city and the police. They feel like they're being treated unfairly, targeted, victimized, stop and search. So they act out by kind of acting more antisocial, which kind of puts us in a vicious cycle. Sometimes racism forces you to suppress how you feel. So you may find that you can't show or even fully express your natural responses to your experience. And to avoid more abuse, you feel like you have to kind of keep yourself quiet and keep yourself safe, and you don't feel like you can react. Again, it's going back to what I was saying about banter. You don't want to be that guy in the group that can't take a joke, and this can lead to you feeling numb, overwhelmed, or worn down. Okay, so that's a lot of theory and context behind it all. Let's go for the money shot. Let's analyse the comments made by Lady Susan Hussey. So these were all done to, as I'm sure you know, Ngozi Fulani, who is the founder of the charity Sistah Space. And this all happened just a couple of days ago during a reception at Buckingham Palace. So what was said and what do I think? Before I get into that, I just want to very briefly introduce you to this channel. This is a Schmike for Schmall Mind, a smorgasbord of topics related to mental illness, criminality, and the crossover between the two. Sometimes I do trending topics like Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein, who else have we got? R. Kelly, Alex Belfield. Sometimes I do older, kind of more forensic-y topics like Dr. Harold Shipman did a video on him recently. Go check it out. There's something for everybody on my channel. I implore you to subscribe. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it will also stop those throbbing, itchy piles that you've been suffering for. Nobody wants to see you scratching your bum through your trousers. It's disgusting. Right, let's get back to the video. Let's analyse the comments made by Lady Susan Hussey. Right off the bat, I just want to say, in my opinion, in itself, it's not necessarily offensive, or it's not offensive in general to ask somebody where they're from. I've been asked this hundreds of times, even recently. I've never minded because, and this is the important bit, the tone has always been inquisitorial. It's always been pleasant. I know a lot of other people, Asians, BAME people, don't feel the same way. So there's a stand-up comic called Hari Kundabalu, who I think is very good, by the way, who mentioned in one of his stand-ups that he once got asked in a coffee shop where he was from, and you can just tell by the whole way he tells a story that he was very offended. I don't subscribe to that way of thinking, but as I said before, it's about lived experience, right? So I don't feel that way because when I've been asked, it's always felt pleasant. And I don't know Harry's individual details, but it's not unreasonable for somebody who grew up in, say, a really racist town where they were constantly victimized, targeted, maybe they were repeatedly called racial slurs at school, maybe beaten up at school. Maybe if you have those experiences and it often starts with the question, where are you from, or being treated differently, then it makes sense to me why you would find this offensive. All of which to say, I don't think it's offensive, but I can understand why other people might. Okay, so let's get back to what happened with Lady Hussey. So the first thing is that she apparently moved the name badge. So she went up to Fulani, and Fulani alleges that Hussey took her lock of hair and moved it out of the way to read the name badge. Now, I think it can be argued that touching somebody's hair, particularly in certain black cultures, without their permission is offensive and it's discriminatory because it makes them feel other. It makes them feel like objects. Personally, I don't think it's that offensive, but I can understand again how people might feel it. Then Fulani claimed that she was repeatedly asked about her origins and that Hussey kept saying what part of the African continent she was from. And again, I think it can be argued that it's offensive and a bit ignorant to assume that because somebody is black that they're from an African continent, because that's not necessarily the case. Now, here's the crux of the matter. I think, me personally, if you ask that question once or even twice because of a misunderstanding, then that is not racist, it's not offensive. But if you ask it repeatedly, then it's got an implication. It implies that you're not accepting or you're mistrusting the answer that you're being given. So to put it into, let's have another, is it simile? Put it into another context. Let's say there's a kid who's just come out of a sweet shop and he's got a lolly. If you say, how did you pay for that? Then that's a reasonable question. But if they answer and then you keep saying, how did you pay for that? Where did you get the money for that? When you've said it 2 or 3 times, you're not asking the question, actually, where did you get the money? You're saying the statement hidden in the question, I don't believe you, I think you stole that. And that is the crux of the matter here. That is the point. By Lady Hussey repeating the question over and over again, she's turned it into something that it wasn't initially. So up until the point that she kept repeating it, I was willing to give Lady Susan Hussey a pass. Again, I've been asked that question, it's not been offensive, but if she keeps repeating it, it becomes offensive. And then she apparently said, no, what part of Africa are you from, when Fulani said that she was born in the UK. And then she said, well, you must know where you're from. And Fulani responded that she didn't know where she was from, which is not unreasonable because due to the slave trades in which millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas and to the Caribbean, sometimes and it was the largest forced migration in human history, sometimes they literally lost track of where their ancestors came from. And if you know your colonial history, which, let's face it, as a representative of the royal family, Hussey should have known the very basics, to keep pushing, I think is actually offensive. So in my opinion, and at this point, it's now overtly intentional racism. And then again, even after all of this, she said no, even when Fulani said that she was from England, Hussey said no, what nationality are you? So she asked her to clarify her nationality, and again, it's this very repeated questioning that's mistrusting, it's not accepting the answer. And there's an implication, is that Fulani is not a British national, even though she just said that she was because of appearance and skin colour. And then she said, no, where do you really come from? Where do your people come from? This is all that she allegedly said. So those terms, really from, and your people, are loaded terms. And it's particularly racially insensitive when you're asking somebody when they've already answered the question. And then it gets even more egregious. Oh, I can see I'm going to have a challenge getting you to say where you're from. When did you come? When did you first come here? So again, the refusal to accept her answer, I think, is showing some hostility. And it's moved on now, in my opinion, from polite conversation to interrogation. And asking somebody when they first came from the UK, when they were born in the UK, is basically calling them a liar. So to summarise all of that, in my opinion, the initial inquiry itself was not racist, but the increasingly aggressive and mistrusting tone absolutely was. Okay, I'm about to conclude this episode and then I'll give you my final thoughts, and I'm going to say something uncomfortable about the history of the royal family. Just to emphasise again, this is my opinion. I'm not trying to say that my beliefs and my ideas are more important than yours. I'm just trying to say that yours are less important than mine. What did we learn about in this episode? We learned about what racism is. We learned about how important context, how vital context is to racism. So the same phrase can be said by 2 different people in 2 different contexts and it not be racist, but it can be in a different set of circumstances. Can racism just be banter? In my opinion, it can, but maybe I'm wrong. Let me know what you think in the Schmom section. We learned about what institutional racism is and how it presents itself in my area, which is mental health care. We also learnt about the psychiatric and the psychological consequences of suffering racism. The final thing I wanted to say is that another thing that I think sometimes gets forgotten is the time. So I guess another basic way of saying that was that racism was acceptable in the ACs. Prince Philip has said hugely worse things, and there was some kind of uproar about it, but he didn't lose his position over it like this lady did. So, for example, the worst thing I think that he said is in 1986, during a visit to China, Prince Philip told British students that they risk going slitty-eyed if they stay in China. I mean, that's pretty goddamn offensive, isn't it? And it did make a little bit of a furore, but it's much less acceptable now in 2022 than it would have been back then. And even our beloved Prince Harry, 2009, he said some pretty awful things. He called a fellow cadet at Sandhurst a racial slur. I'm not going to say it, it's the P word for Asians. He called another a raghead, and he filmed himself on video doing this. And now he accuses the royal family of racism himself, which is a bit like the pot calling the kettle coloured. Anyway, I'm not trying to have a massive go at all members of the royal family and it's all in the past. I'm just saying that it's a pattern, it's not a one-off thing, and also that time is also part of all the context. Anyway, I've rabbited long enough. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Have a blessed day. Buy my goddamn book. Subscribe. I need the followers because I have such a fragile ego. Have a blessed weekend. And do not forget, I love you.